In this video,
and even though that's like a, like an affirmation, like, oh, you're so strong and, it's a good thing, right? It actually creates a lot of shame for when she's not feeling strong. It leaves out and silences the struggles of people and shames, people who aren't this model minority.
hey everybody, I'm Asmara and welcome back to the channel. So as you can tell by the title of today's video, we are going to be revisiting Life is Strange True Colors. So I'm a huge Life is Strange fan. I've played through Life is Strange 2 and 3 on the channel, but today we are going to be looking at Life is Strange True Colors from a bit of a deeper lens. So I got a professional on for you guys. We are upgrading in these streets, and she is going to help me unpack many of the themes explored in Life is Strange True Colors. So I have invited Angela Wu, who also goes by the name of the Sassy Asian Therapist on the internet. Angela is a licensed family and marriage therapist as well as an empowerment coach, and she actually found her start in psychotherapy from the classroom. During her former profession as a math teacher, she found a lot of her students struggling with stress and racial trauma that came from a lot of structural inequalities. And so that inspired her to pursue a degree in counseling. Now you can find Angela working with her own clients as well as posting funny and informative insights on Instagram, all with the goal of uplifting the mental health needs of culturally diverse communities, and especially those from the Asian diaspora. I'm so excited for you guys to meet Angela and hear our conversation. We talk about a lot of really interesting topics, from things like gender roles and grief, ways to process grief, abandonment, emotional intelligence, just a lot of different themes from Life is Strange True Colors. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and hop right into the video. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself and what you do, who you are, and sort of what your brand is about?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Angela. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm known on Instagram as the Sassy Asian Therapist. I specifically work with Asian Americans with Asian mental health. And I'm also a life coach, so working with Asian Americans to break out of, whatever social context and box and frameworks feel like they've been put in order to take up space and find their empowered selves.
Yes, I love that. So today we're going to be talking about Life is Strange True Colors, which is a game that I've played on my channel before. I'm a huge Life is Strange fan, and I thought this game in particular was really interesting with the way they tackle like mental health themes, like family dynamics, and kind of exploring a lot of topics that don't typically get explored, especially in video games. And so one of like the biggest sort of overarching themes I've noticed, at least in Life is Strange True Colors, is about emotional intelligence and kind of what it means to be an empath or have like this supernatural empathetic ability. So I'm wondering, just from a therapist standpoint, what role do emotions kind of play in our lives, and how are emotions like valuable to us?
Yeah, that's a great question, because as I was watching these clips, I was like, oh my gosh, Alex is almost like a therapist.
Yes.
That's my superpower. But emotions, are basically pieces of information. Like, it's what, biologically has taught us how to survive, right? Like, when we are triggered in particular ways where we like feel in danger, like it activates in our bodies. So they're actually pieces of information that we can use to teach us like about situations, about ourselves, how to navigate. And basically biologically it was for survival. But now, there's been such a disconnect with emotions, or people don't understand it, and so there's this kind of shunning away. So there's a part of us that we fragment, and by rejecting these very emotions, we kind of reject our ability to be human.
I know what other people are feeling. I can see these auras around them.
Never thought I'd have a freaky empath friend.
So when it comes to emotions, how did you see this, or how would you see this sort of dynamic play out with a lot of your client base? Because I know you work with a lot of Asian Americans. How do you see that kind of show up in your work?
That's a great question, because I think that's really just the meat of my work, because Asian culture, a lot of, emotional expression is, culturally frowned upon, because there's a value for emotional control. And that's like rooted in like a lot of Confucius ideologies. And so a lot of Asian Americans and my clients grow up being emotionally like illiterate. They don't know what they're experiencing, because oftentimes there's this minimalization of the feeling, right? Either probably from their parents. And I want to say it's not that it's the parents' fault, but there's so many factors that come to it, because in order to know how to sort through your emotions is actually a privilege. So if you're coming from a background, like you're a refugee and you're immigrating to the States, like all you're thinking of for your family and your kids is survival and getting your basic needs met, which if you think about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar.
I was just thinking about that. Yeah.
Exactly. Like that's the bottom rung, right? It's basic needs, then emotional needs, then like self-actualization, right? So for some of us, our parents, their ceiling is just having their basic needs met. And that's like all they have capacity for. They don't have the ability to sit and like ask themselves, what am I feeling, right? Because of like trauma that they went through. The second that they sit down and ask themselves what they're feeling, like they're not going to emotionally survive, let alone physically survive, right? And so for us, second generation, who already had our basic needs met, and of course some of us don't, right? But those of us who do, like that, the basic needs is our floor. So we're able to enter this next rung of like having our emotional needs met. And so there's a lot of like trying to reckon and understand emotions right now that previously like our parents wouldn't have been able to model to us. So a lot of my work with my clients is like helping them relate to their emotions, understand, sort through them, and reframe the way that they see emotions, because it's oftentimes like demonized in Asian culture.
And how is it important that we like communicate our emotions or understand the emotions of others? Like, how important is that? Is it important? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is emotional intelligence, right? Being able to recognize whether your own emotions or other people's emotions, and be able to manage it or communicate it, in a way that is conducive to the relationship. But I would say, like, just because people are emotional or are in tune with their emotions, right? Like empath, doesn't necessarily mean that they are emotionally intelligent. It just means they feel a lot, right? But may not have that particular skill to navigate the emotions.
For people who maybe are very empathetic or kind of feel emotions deeply, what sort of boundaries should they set to make sure emotions aren't over consuming them? You know, when does like kind of being empathetic kind of can become maladaptive, if it can?
Yeah, that's a great question. I see a lot of clients like, cope with this in various ways. Some like try to just, demonize their emotions, kind of like shut off, like, oh, my emotions aren't true. Like, I'm going to shut that off. But your emotions are valid, but they stem from thoughts that, may be a little bit skewed, maybe based off of untruth. Right? Like the way we perceive things can have multiple angles. So let's say me and you, like we, something happens and you see it one way, it affects you that way. And then I see it a different way and I don't get affected in the same way that you do. Right. And so it really depends on the way we view situations, our perceptions. And when our perceptions are not, aligned with the actual truth, right? causes something called cognitive distortions that can affect our feelings, and then our feelings affect our actions, right? And so what we do is like we really recognize like what are the thoughts that are affecting my emotions. So while my emotions may be valid based on my belief, right? Is my belief actually true? Or if it's true, is it helpful for me?
Yeah, I think that's definitely like one of like the biggest themes in Life is Strange is like how do emotions play in our lives and how to read other people's emotions or how to understand our own, and why that's important, I guess, to the main character, at least, Alex. But another thing that really shaped, I think, Alex's experience is the way she grew up. So Alex definitely comes from a very broken background, a broken home. And it kind of starts with the death of her mother. And so I showed you the clip, and I'm just wondering, from a therapist standpoint, what do you notice sort of in this scene where Alex is almost sort of given the responsibility to be the strong one in her family? How does that show up with your client work? And what does that just look like?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that scene for sure. I think that, you know, on an individual level, like in that video, she's like 10 years old and she's already like the first part where dad walks in, the first thing he says to Alex is like, Alex, go check on your mother, which already shows that at 10 years old and maybe younger, she's already put in this caregiver type of role. And it could be also gender norms too, because she has an older brother, but you know, dad doesn't go, oh, brother, go check. Right. So gender norms in Asian families is a big thing. At a very young age, she's parentified, which means that she has to be the caregiver, even though she's a kid. That's like pretty, you know, when you think about Asian mental health and immigrant families, right? That is a pretty common thing where there's this role reversal, where the kid has to be this caregiver and has to be strong because there's things in the system, right? Like language barriers or things like that, that parents aren't able to navigate. And so kids are put as sort of the cultural brokers. And then there's this added layer, you know, in Alex's case, where, you know, her mom is sick. And so now she really has to be strong. And even though that's like a, you know, like an affirmation, like, oh, you're so strong. And, you know, it's a good thing, right? It actually creates a lot of shame for when she's not feeling strong, right? Like, oh, there's something wrong with her. She doesn't have permission to be weak, right? She always has to keep it together all the time, which is really just unrealistic. And then where my brain goes also is when I zoom out and I think about structurally as Asian Americans, we have this like good stereotype, right? Like we're this model minority, we're successful, we're smart, we're good at math, like we're hardworking, we don't complain. And these are all good stereotypes, but it doesn't give us permission when we don't, you know, when we're not those things. It leaves out and silences the struggles of people who, and shames, you know, people who aren't this model minority.
Yeah, I think that's definitely important, even with things that may be seen as positive stereotypes, that positive stereotypes still kind of perpetuate this idea of shame if you don't, you know, live up to that. So there's even an issue with having those things that we may deem as positive stereotypes or positive labels as well. So I love that you mentioned that. In your experience, what kind of behaviors do you think that the strong ones usually adapt sort of in their own lives? Like what sort of mentalities, like how can we identify people who might, whether self-imposed or imposed on other people, be seen as the strong one?
Yeah, a lot of perfectionism, like always having to, you know, have things together, striving for the best, like almost to the point of having unrealistic expectations. There's a really strong inner critic, and shame is so big. Shame is almost the driving force because anything that is not up to like strong standards, perfectionism, it's like unacceptable, right?
Yeah.
And so, these, and then almost like people pleasing behaviors as well, right? Always having to say yes, yes, yes to people other than themselves. So difficulty with saying no, because they're always having to care for other people and think of others before themselves.
Alex has spent most of her life suppressing her own emotional needs and focusing on others.
And I think we can definitely see that even as you kind of play the game, how everything is kind of about Alex taking care of other people before she listens to, herself and her own desires and wants. And how can we sort of just in society sort of take care of the strong ones in our lives and kind of also remind them that their needs are valuable too? Like, what are some tips you would have for us who have these people in our lives?
I mean, it's really hard because people who are in this role too, they're like this for a reason, right? Maybe they're coming from families where, there's someone who's sick, right? Father is mentally ill, mother is physically ill, right? And it forces Alex to be in the middle, kind of the mediator. And when you have in situations where there's mental illness or addiction or something in the family, there's a lot of codependent behaviors, right? And so codependent people are often very responsible, always striving for perfection, give self-sacrifice, lack of boundaries, what people feel it's almost like they feel 100% because their identities are so fused with others. So this empath ability in the back of my brain is almost okay, or how much of this is codependency, the need to have to help others, the need to be needed, because that's how she finds her self-worth, right? So I think it's really understanding partly where that comes from, because when you come from a family with that type of dynamic and you're the one that is responsible for creating homeostasis, it's not so easy for them to just break out of it and be oh yeah, have my needs met. So there's going to be some kind of resistance, and not make them feel shame for it, right? But to almost give permission, you don't need to feel guilty for having your needs met, right? It's totally okay. Because there is an association, growing up in families like that, if you have your needs met, you're selfish, or there's a guilty piece, right? So helping them know that you don't need to feel guilty, you deserve this, this is normal, your needs are important. So releasing them from those responsibilities.
It was my job to keep it.
You were 11 years old. Be angry at Dad, miss Mom. Hell, be angry at me. But don't give up. No one gets to tell you what you're worth.
And I think another sort of defining moment, at least for Alex in her life, is how her family changes after her mother passes. So in another scene, we can see her brother Gabe sort of going more towards a rebellion sort of side, where Alex kind of is the fixer, wants to fix everything. And like you were saying, sort of take on this more parental role, even though she is very young. So what do you notice in a family dynamic like this? What are the, for lack of better words, good or bad or healthy or unhealthy sort of parts of these dynamics? And yeah, what do you notice?
Yeah, so I guess sibling order is really important too, and gender. And so gender norms. So depending on your family structure, right? And how traditional these views are, you may either conform to these frameworks, or you may rebel against these frameworks, right? And so with Gabe, it sounds like he's doing the more rebellious act, right? And maybe because he's a male, he's allowed to be more rebellious, right? But then there's an added dynamic, from the cultural side, is that Asian culture really values the male, it's very patriarchal. And so him rebelling is a double no, because it's you're supposed to be the good son, you're supposed to carry the family, you know. And then when you have a dynamic where like one sibling is sort of like the rebellious one, it adds pressure to other siblings of like having to like make sure like they don't burden or hurt their parents in that same way. So then they may become very like accommodating, like people pleasing, perfect, because the last thing they want to do is rock the boat because they've seen the pain from what their other sibling has done.
Kind of fall into more codependent patterns, right?
Yeah, they become the one that stabilizes the family unit. Like that scene where Alex is in the middle between her dad and Gabe fighting, right? And she's like trying to stabilize it to the point where she even says, like, her dad pushes her something and she even says, "Oh, I'm not hurt," right? It's like denying her own self and her own pain in order to keep this family unit.
And later down the line, Alex and Gabe eventually make up, like as they're older and they're adults. Gabe kind of turns his life around, and Alex, she comes out of foster care. But one of my viewers, one of my channel members, wanted to know how can sort of shared trauma either bring people together or separate them? Like, is trauma bonding, I guess, a real thing? And how do those experiences, especially at young ages, sort of shape our relationship with those who also experience that with us?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely helps in a way where it makes you feel less alone when you know that someone has gone through similar experiences, right? It's kind of like you don't have to explain, they just kind of know, right? There's some things, it's this unspoken knowing. I would say like trauma bonding is real when it and I don't necessarily feel like it's healthy, right? Like there's, you know, like there's the bonding that comes from like shared experience, right? And then like trauma bonding, it's almost like another level where there's this kind of your relationship is only based upon your trauma, not anything else. There's something also called post-traumatic growth, right? Where you like do the work of healing from trauma and you rise out stronger from it. And that is something that, you know, you can journey with others in doing, right? Whether it's in like, you know, you could do it in group therapy or other like, you know, different situations where you're like both striving towards mental health, right? There's that definitely like a way where you can grow together.
When I moved to Haven Springs, I hadn't seen my brother Gabe in years.
I want you to have a fresh start here.
I wanted to sort of segue into, I know that Alex went to foster care. That's like a big part of her story. In that particular scene where Alex is sort of reflecting on the ways she's been rejected, I guess, in her life, particularly as it came to like going through different families. What do you notice sort of in those scenes just from your background?
I think a huge piece is this feeling of abandonment, right? Of not being wanted by all these people. And not only that for her, but it's like from your own parents, right? One with her dad was this voluntary sort of abandonment, and from her mom was this involuntary abandonment, which still like creates this fear of abandonment, whether voluntary or involuntary, right? And so that is already what she's coming in with. And then on top of that, hearing like the foster parents like say that she's broken or she's just too much or she's gone through things, it's, you know, it's these added layers of rejection. I would say rejection is one of the most painful things that people experience because we are biologically wired to be social. It's necessary for our survival. And there's actually this study on like emotional pain and this physical pain where they map the brain and they see which part of the brain activates. And so they did a study where, someone got hurt physically and then someone who got rejected socially, and the same part of the brain activated, which goes to show like social rejection hurts just as much as like if you got a broken arm, right? But the thing is, because it's unseen, you don't know how to tend and nurture it. And so a lot of the times is you dismiss it, you invalidate it, it's not there, right? Whereas a broken arm, you could get it like a splint or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because, you know, this emotional pain is unseen, this rejection piece, it's like we're walking around with this open wound that we don't know. So I see that in a lot of like foster kids, like they become really reactive. It's because they have this open wound, right? And and it gets wider and wider. And then like these smallest things will set them off. Yeah. And so then they can build these like really, really tough walls around this only to protect themselves from being triggered all the time, right?
Yeah. What are some ways that you would recommend sort of moving towards healing if you came from either foster care or if you just have, you know, these sort of tough walls around you for whatever other reason?
I think for people who've had experiences of a lot of rejection foster care, it is hard to trust. Like that's the number one thing of like, who can you trust? Who's not going to hurt you, right? And so I think it's like recognizing, like being able to read the signs of like who are the people in your life who are trustworthy, right? And slowly allowing those walls to not chip down, because like walls are, you know, they're important, or boundaries are important, but maybe like allowing that wall to have a door, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe that wall can be more like a fence or a gate, right? And slowly like allowing yourself to step out of that fear and comfort zone and allow people slowly to come in, right? But it really takes like being in a safe environment, healthy family, or a healthy environment to be able to like slowly let those walls down. And I think a safe containment would be like in a therapeutic relationship. And that's our intention. Every time we go in with a client is like creating a safe containment to meet the client where they're at. And so consent is such a big thing, like when we're coming from a trauma-informed lens, right? You know, people who have been in situations like being, you know, growing up as a foster kid, they didn't have a choice. And so as a therapist is letting them know that you have choice. If you say no, that's no. You know, we're not going to go there for you. And slowly allowing people to realize that they're in control and they have power. They're not powerless. From that standpoint is building that trust and safety.
You'll need help.
I've got your back.
Moving on to sort of another sort of idea that Life is Strange talks about. One of the main characters, Gabe, he dies. that happens early on in the story. So that's not like a spoiler or anything. But something that else I thought was interesting was sort of witnessing throughout the game how various characters like grieved his passing. In one of the scenes I showed you, Ethan, who is Charlotte's son, Charlotte is Gabe's girlfriend. In the scene where Ethan sort of kind of starts isolating himself, and Ethan is a kid, so it is kind of normal for, you know, kids to not necessarily know the best ways to kind of, you know, express their emotions or anything like that. But at the same time, his mother, Charlotte, also tries to hold it together and kind of become the strong one in this grieving situation. So how important is it for us to sort of be honest with our emotions and process them when it comes to grief?
So, you know, at the end of that scene you're talking about, where Alex talks to Charlotte about how she needs to be strong. And Alex, I think the last line says, like, maybe it's okay to show him that you're hurt, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was really powerful, because when parents or, you know, us, whatever, like we feel like we need to be strong, it does not allow, you know, kids or other people to feel like they can, you know, share their emotions. It's almost as if like they're modeling how to manage like emotions is like suppress them and be strong, right? So it doesn't create safety to be anything other than strong, right? And so when Alex says like maybe it's okay to let him know that you're hurting, it normalizes pain. It normalizes grief and loss. And there's so much more safety in doing that. It gives you permission to be human and actually feel things, right? But I think a lot of parents feel like, oh, like if I lose it, like that's gonna, you know, be bad for my kid. But you don't have to lose it, but you can show feelings, right? The way you handle and manage your own emotions is going to model to your kids how they can handle their emotions, right? So I wonder if like Ethan doesn't feel safe to go to Charlotte, or there's this like, you know, distance because maybe he doesn't feel like he can show his true feelings.
How would you say that kind of shows up in your work?
Oh, I see it all the time of like this like kind of back and forth whiplash of, you know, trying to be strong, but then grieving and strong and grieving, you know, or like we've seen, and maybe you'll talk about this later, like this anger and shame, right? It's like, oh, I shouldn't be angry. I'm such a bad mom, you know, but I'm really angry, but that, you know, I'm such a bad mom kind of thing. And so like shame in grief is really what keeps people from like fully going through the stages of grief, because they're not allowing themselves. There's this like image of being strong that they're holding up to. And when they allow themselves to feel angry or sad or whatever, it creates shame. Shame will keep you in this like cycle, right? Which will draw this grief process out even longer and more torturously.
I love what you said about shame, because I definitely noticed that a lot in Charlotte's character. And one of my favorite authors, researchers, Brené Brown, she does a lot of work around shame and vulnerability. And I love the way she defines shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. But I also am curious about how do we process our emotions without dwelling in them? Because obviously if we dwell in our emotions and allow them to sort of keep resurfacing, that doesn't do any good for our healing. But we obviously need to talk about, or at least acknowledge our emotions in some way to move towards the healing to begin with. So what is that line between dwelling in our emotions and sort of allowing them to resurface versus processing them? What would you say?
The difference between processing painful events and dwelling in them is that when you're dwelling in things, you keep bringing it up and thinking about them in a way that causes distress. And so that distress, a lot of it comes from this notion of, why am I still thinking about this? I shouldn't be, or I wish I wasn't thinking about this. And when you think that way, when there's a sense of rejection, and with rejection, there's this self-invalidation. So even though you are dealing with this painful memory, the fact that you're not allowing yourself to fully deal with it, to fully be, to fully validate that experience, keeps it stuck and going in this circular pattern. On the other hand, processing painful emotion comes with being able to validate those emotions rather than rejecting them. So it means creating a safe space where you're gonna let yourself feel those things without shaming yourself out of them, without shoulding yourself, without minimizing or invalidating.
Yeah, that makes sense. So allowing yourself to be present in your emotion without the rejection or shame sort of imposed upon yourself.
And what would you say, like, the different stages of grief have you noticed from the clips I've shown you from any character?
Yeah, I mean, with Ethan, it sounds like he may be in that stage of, depression or maybe even anger of himself, or, it's hard to tell just by watching, but he could be going through all those things like denial that it's happening. So he's kind of like distancing in his own world. He could be angry. So he's like, with his, I think Alex, he was kind of like, irritable. Could be bargaining, thinking like, what if I did this? Like, I shouldn't have done that, the what ifs. And he's kind of more isolated in his own thoughts. He could be depressed. He could be, sad, wanting to isolate, right? It doesn't seem like he's in this acceptance stage because he's not back to, his normal functioning. And then even with Charlotte, this like anger piece, that's so huge. And anger and shame is what I notice a lot. And it's almost like, and something I want to kind of break down and add more nuance to is the fact that like she feels guilty or angry for, being angry at her own son. And I kind of want to break that down because her anger is valid, right? But I wonder if her anger is actually more towards Ethan's actions than who he actually is, who he is as a person, right?
Yeah.
Because she's not seeing that nuance, right? That's what makes her feel like I'm such a bad mom, right? But if she's able to see like, I'm angry at his action, she'll start to see like her anger as valid. Yeah, like he didn't listen, right? And not feel as guilty because it's like, but I still love him because he's my son. He is not, he's separate from his actions.
Yeah. So would you say like when grieving, it's important to sort of make a distinction about why you're feeling what you're feeling? Whereas maybe on the surface, Charlotte thinks that she's angry at her son, but if you search a little bit deeper, it's more so what her son did that seems to have led to the death of Gabe. So is that like a mental process that is like helpful for people who are grieving?
So yeah, we make meaning out of things, right? And so when we feel a certain way and there's guilt or shame, we immediately internalize beliefs about ourselves. So for Charlotte, because she felt angry, she immediately internalized like, I'm a bad mom. And so what we do when something that's really good practice is when you start to feel guilt or shame, you got to ask yourself, what am I believing about myself that's not true?
Like, what's the story you're telling yourself?
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time it's sort of this like black and white, all like thinking like, if I do this, then I am that. And you got to tell yourself there's a lot of gray space and there's a lot of nuance within those, and challenge yourself to see other perspectives and reasons.
Yeah. And another thing I wanted to touch on is how Ethan, especially at the beginning of, I guess, his grieving process, was also sort of kind of retreating to this isolation stage. And so I wanted to know, is isolating yourself a healthy thing for anyone at any age, even though Ethan is kind of younger and sort of starting to figure this out? Is isolation ever healthy? What do you notice, I guess, about that?
I think isolation, when we are true to the term, which means like prolonged periods of time, like is not necessarily healthy, but having your own space, I think that's healthy, right? There's a difference. Like you take the time you need and you set your boundaries to kind of like regulate yourself, right? And maybe you need time to kind of like work through things. That's different than isolation, which is like a prolonged state of loneliness or being secluded and separate from other people.
Honestly, I'm really trying to keep it together for Ethan. He's shutting me out. He's never done that before. Not when it mattered.
Okay, so to round out sort of our conversation on grief and what that looks like for different characters and also just in our own lives, what are some grief kind of coping techniques would you recommend, whether people are kind of going through something tough and just trying to figure out, how do I even understand what I'm going through and how can I make this better? Like, what are some tips or what are some like practical kind of steps you can give my viewers?
Yeah, so there's a lot. You know, grief is really like emotions are stored in the body. And so like your body is going to feel that energy, that grief, just like really trapped in there. And so one thing I would say is like, move your body, go for a walk, like get yourself out of that environment, shift environments, right? Exercise, like, you know, sweat out that grief. Another thing is, you know, journaling is really helpful if you really want to sort through like some of your thoughts, right? Usually with my clients, I write letters. We practice writing letters to loved ones, right? And like symbolically kind of like letting that go, you know, in a way of like regrets or things that you wish you should have like could have said. You know, therapy is a good one because like there are interventions that we use in, you know, in our sessions that allow individuals to kind of release their grief. I'd say also like, don't be alone in this. Find someone that you feel safe with, where you can kind of just be without feeling judged or whatever, where you feel like you can just let your walls down. So that's a really important one as well.
Yeah. I was even thinking like, I don't know if you've seen like those feelings charts or those feeling circles. I think sometimes that can be helpful if you're trying to first figure out what you're even feeling in the first place. Because I remember hearing somebody say a lot of times we just group our emotions into good or bad, but there's a lot of nuance in between there. And so I feel like that could even help some people sort of start.
And bad emotions are not bad. There are no bad emotions. Every piece of emotion is telling us something, you know, just information. But yes, emotional literacy, like getting to know like what you are feeling and the nuance of that is so important too.
And so I feel like one of the biggest things that Alex sort of comes to term with at the end of the game is how to be okay with being herself and how to, I guess, understand the different things that have happened to her in life and overcoming that. And I know that a lot of your work centers on having your clients, whether through counseling or coaching, embrace their authentic selves. And so I want to know, why is authenticity and sort of coming to terms with your truest self important to you and for the work that you do?
Well, the first word that comes to mind is freedom. You know, freedom from the constructs that tell you that you can't be you, that you need to wear these particular masks or create these like inauthentic shells of yourself. Because what those shells are, they're prisons that you are keeping yourself in. And so when you access your authentic self, you are releasing yourself from these cages, either from society, culture, gender, you know, religion, whatever, right? Where you can just be free to be. And I think like that is the space where a freedom that I, you know, constantly work towards, right? Have tasted, right? And I want my clients to be able to find that liberation as well.
And why do you think especially it's important for your clients who are Asian or from the, you know, the Asian diaspora? Like, why do you think that's specifically important to also your culture as well?
Yeah, because our culture has a lot of values and expectations, you know, that we feel like we need to abide by. A huge one is saving face. That stems from this like honor and shame sort of dynamic, right? We need to honor, like we represent our whole family. We need to always have this like put together kind of strong, perfect demeanor, right? Because anything other than that is like shameful. And so there's this practice actually of saving face, where you don't air out your dirty laundry. You only like present yourself in a good light, right? Because not only are you representing yourself, but your entire family. And so it's kind of like understanding that force that is causing you to create this like inauthentic version of yourself, and slowly start to dismantle that and know that it's safe to dismantle that. For some people, it's not, unfortunately, right? Because of the context or families that they're in. And unfortunately, some people, in order to shed that layer, have to cut off from unhealthy like family or environment. And so it's a privilege to be able to do that, but it's important to do that if, you know, we want that freedom.
Yeah, like at the other side of masks and shame is freedom when you kind of let go of that. To sort of round us out, do you have any like specific mental health resources directed towards mental health in general, or even like Asian mental health specifically?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different directories, therapist directories that I can like forward to you and you can share with your viewers, that breaks it down to like, if you specifically want to find an Asian therapist or a Black and Brown therapist or a Latinx or a queer therapist, or, you know, it's not just this, you know, Psychology Today. That's not like the main directory anymore, which is like very, I would say, not people of color friendly. And so there's so many different platforms where you can find a culturally affirming therapist who is aware of like structural racism and different like systemic oppressive like practices. So I could definitely share that with you. Another thing is to like, don't be afraid to go there. Don't be afraid to feel things, and like know that like your feelings are valid, even though like sometimes you're like, it's totally irrational, right? But that means there's just this misunderstanding of your feeling, and all you have to do is like find ways to understand it, right? And once you cultivate a relationship with your emotions, that's when you can start to become more aligned with yourself.
Yes. So I'll get those resources from you. I'll make sure to put them in the description so, you know, we all can, you know, live a better, healthier mental life. But yes, thank you so much for those tips. Last but not least, where can we follow you and learn more about what you do?
Yeah, you can follow me on my Instagram at The Sassy Asian Therapist, or just go on my website, www.thesassyasiantherapist.com.
All right, I love that username also. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you guys enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. If this video added value to you, be sure to engage with it. Leave a like and a comment below about something that you learned today. Of course, do not forget to take advantage of the links in the description to sources that talk more about things we discussed today, or to just follow Angela. I'm going to go ahead and leave her Instagram in the description so you guys can go follow her. She posts a lot of really informative and funny things that I think will add to your guys' lives and your mental health journey. Thank you again for tuning in. And also check out my Life is Strange True Colors Let's Play if you haven't already. I'm gonna go ahead and attach that to this video as well. Thank you all so much, and I'm gonna talk to you guys later. Bye y'all.